When the letter arrived with a $500 fine for grass exceeding regulation height, I couldn't have imagined this lawn war would become one of the most intriguing legal battles I'd ever witness. The story of my clash with the HOA president epitomizes the fascinating tension between neighborhood authority and the constitutional rights we so often take for granted. Picture this: Judge Sarah Chen, the newest appointee to the Supreme Court, living her first suburban homeowner experience in the meticulously maintained Maple Grove Estates, facing off against Bill Thompson, a 15-year HOA president whose dedication to lawn perfection has become legendary in the community. Fresh from high-stakes constitutional deliberations in Washington, D.C., Judge Chen found herself confronting a different kind of justice system, one governed by homeowner association bylaws rather than the Constitution she'd sworn to uphold. Thompson, armed with measuring tapes and clipboards, approached his role with the same intensity a general might bring to military strategy. Neither could have predicted that their conflict over 3 inches of grass would ultimately reshape community governance principles and create an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect for the law, albeit different interpretations of it. Sometimes the most profound legal battles emerge from the most mundane circumstances, and this suburban standoff proved no exception. The pristine community of Maple Grove Estates operated under what residents called Thompson's Law, a comprehensive set of HOA regulations that Bill Thompson had refined over his 15 years as president. Every blade of grass, every mailbox design, every paint color had been scrutinized and codified into a thick binder that new homeowners received upon arrival. The 3-inch grass height rule was just one of 47 landscaping regulations, but Thompson considered it the foundation of community standards. Judge Sarah Chen learned this the hard way when she received her first official notice, a formal letter typed on cream-colored letterhead: Violation Notice Number 4732, grass height exceeds 3.25 inches in front yard quadrant B2. Immediate correction required. Chen had been wrestling with a particularly complex constitutional case involving digital privacy rights, spending 18-hour days in her chambers poring over legal precedents. Her lawn, once pristine under the previous owner's care, had become a casualty of her devotion to justice. The grass had grown to a rebellious 4 inches, an inch of defiance that would set this entire saga in motion. Thompson's first personal interaction came on a Saturday morning. Dressed in his signature khaki shorts and HOA polo shirt, clipboard in hand, he approached Chen's front door with the measured confidence of a man who'd handled thousands of violations. Chen answered in her weekend attire, jeans and a faded law school sweatshirt, looking far from the imposing figure she cut in her Supreme Court robes. "Ma'am, I'm Bill Thompson, HOA President. We need to discuss your lawn situation." Chen, still nursing her morning coffee, initially assumed this was a neighborly welcome. She quickly learned otherwise. Thompson explained the violation process, the importance of community standards, and the escalating fine structure. Chen listened with the same attention she'd give to oral arguments, noting the careful legal language in the HOA's documentation. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your diligence, but I've been handling some pressing cases. I'll address the lawn when I can." Thompson's expression hardened. He'd heard similar excuses countless times before. 3 weeks passed. Chen's grass continued its upward trajectory, now approaching 5 inches in what Thompson privately referred to as the nuclear option territory. Meanwhile, Chen had been absorbed in drafting a landmark decision on property rights, ironically working on defining the balance between community regulations and individual freedoms. The second notice arrived via certified mail, hand-delivered by Thompson himself. This time, the stakes were higher: $500 fine enacted per HOA Bylaws Section 11.3.7. Payment due within 14 days or legal action will be initiated. Chen read the notice while eating lunch in her chambers, surrounded by leather-bound legal texts. Something about the authoritative tone struck her as familiar, the same unquestioning authority she often challenged in government overreach cases. She decided to respond, not as a frustrated homeowner, but as a constitutional scholar. Her reply letter cited property rights precedents dating back to 1791 and questioned the reasonable application of aesthetic regulations. Thompson received Chen's response with confusion that quickly turned to irritation. In his 15 years of HOA enforcement, no one had cited Supreme Court cases in response to a grass violation. He consulted the association's lawyer, who assured him the HOA bylaws were legally binding contracts. "It doesn't matter if she's a legal expert," the lawyer said. "She signed the HOA agreement. The rules apply equally." Thompson felt vindicated and doubled down, initiating formal proceedings to place a lien on Chen's property. What he didn't realize was that Chen had deliberately let this escalate, seeing it as a fascinating case study in the limits of private governance. The certified letter arriving at her Supreme Court office announcing legal action was the moment she decided to fully engage. "I think it's time Mr. Thompson met Judge Chen," she told her clerk with a rare smile. The first indication that something was amiss came when Thompson's lawyer called him, voice shaking slightly. "Bill, you need to sit down. We've done some research on your homeowner, Sarah Chen. She's on the Supreme Court." Thompson initially laughed, thinking it was a joke. When the reality sank in, his first emotion wasn't fear but determination. So what? The law is the law, whether you're a janitor or a judge. But his confidence wavered when he researched Chen's background: Harvard Law Review, clerk for Justice Ginsburg, architect of several landmark property rights decisions. He'd essentially picked a legal fight with one of the most powerful jurisprudential minds in the country. The HOA's next move was to fast-track the case to local housing court, hoping to resolve it quickly before media attention intensified. But Chen had already begun preparing her defense, treating it with the same meticulous care she'd bring to any Supreme Court case. She researched the constitutional foundations of HOA enforcement, the evolution of community association law, and found several instances where courts had struck down overly rigid aesthetic regulations. Her strategy wasn't just to win but to establish precedent about reasonable limitations on HOA authority. The first court hearing drew unexpected attention. Local news had caught wind of Supreme Court Justice versus HOA President and framed it as a quintessential David versus Goliath story, though no one could quite figure out who was David. Thompson arrived at court in his best suit, accompanied by his lawyer and 3 HOA board members for moral support. Chen appeared without representation. She planned to argue her own case. When the judge called the court to order and Chen stood to present her defense, Thompson realized for the first time the full magnitude of what he'd initiated. Her opening statement was masterful. "Your Honor, this case represents a fundamental question about the balance between community standards and individual constitutional rights. While I respect the purpose of homeowner associations, we must examine whether rigid enforcement of aesthetic regulations without consideration of reasonableness or circumstances serves the community's best interests." For the next hour, Chen dissected the HOA's enforcement practices, citing cases from multiple circuit courts and 3 Supreme Court decisions she'd personally authored. Thompson watched, increasingly uncomfortable, as Chen methodically dismantled the legal foundations of strict HOA enforcement while acknowledging the legitimate interests of community associations. She didn't attack the HOA system itself but rather argued for a standard of reasonableness in application and enforcement. When Thompson took the stand to defend the HOA's position, he found himself being questioned by a legal mind that operated on a completely different level. Chen's cross-examination was gentle but surgical, exposing contradictions in the HOA's enforcement history and revealing instances where exceptions had been made for board members and their families. The local judge, clearly overwhelmed by having a Supreme Court justice in his courtroom, kept his questions brief and allowed Chen considerable latitude in her presentation. The media attention exploded during a recess when someone recognized Chen and word spread. By day 2 of the hearing, the courthouse steps were filled with cameras and reporters. What had begun as a simple neighborhood dispute had evolved into a national conversation about HOA authority, property rights, and the application of law regardless of social status. Thompson found himself defending not just his HOA but the entire concept of community associations on national television. "The rules exist for everyone's benefit," he told a CNN reporter. Allowing exceptions based on who you are undermines the whole system. Chen, cornered by the same reporter, took a more nuanced approach. This isn't about who I am, it's about whether our community standards should include considerations of reasonableness and individual circumstances. The courtroom tension reached its peak when Chen delivered her closing argument. Speaking directly to the local judge but with an awareness that her words would ripple far beyond this room, she summarized the core issue. This case asks us to define the boundaries of private governance in America. While homeowner associations serve vital functions in maintaining property values and community standards, they cannot operate as miniature dictatorships immune from basic principles of fairness and reasonableness. She paused, looking at Thompson, who sat ramrod straight in his chair. Mr. Thompson's dedication to his community is admirable. His enforcement has been consistent and thorough. But consistency without wisdom can become tyranny, even in the most well-intentioned hands. The judge nodded slowly, clearly wrestling with the challenge of adjudicating a dispute that had grown far beyond its original scope. 3 days later, the judge issued his ruling. Chen had won on several key points. The HOA must consider mitigating circumstances before levying fines, violations must be genuinely reasonable rather than arbitrary, and enforcement must include a documented appeals process that didn't require costly litigation. However, the judge also upheld the fundamental authority of HOAs to maintain community standards, finding a careful balance that neither side had fully anticipated. Outside the courthouse, Thompson approached Chen as cameras rolled. Judge Chen, he began formally, then caught himself. Sarah, I think we've both learned something here. Chen smiled, the same expression she used when a particularly astute oral argument reframed her thinking on a case. Bill, would you like to get coffee? I think we have more to discuss than just grass height. Their first coffee meeting lasted 3 hours. Thompson arrived defensive, expecting a lecture on constitutional law. Instead, he found Chen genuinely interested in his perspective on community management. She asked detailed questions about the challenges of maintaining property values, dealing with residents who pushed boundaries, and balancing individual complaints against collective interests. Thompson, in turn, discovered Chen wasn't the detached judicial elite he'd imagined. She spoke passionately about her small-town upbringing, her parents' sacrifice to help her through law school, and her surprise at finding herself in suburban homeowner politics after decades focused on federal law. You know, she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, I've ruled on cases involving billions of dollars and constitutional principles that affect millions. But this grass height dispute taught me something about power that all those Supreme Court cases didn't. Thompson leaned forward, intrigued. What's that? Chen smiled. That power, whether it's derived from a black robe or an HOA president's clipboard, requires constant self-examination. You challenged me to examine my responsibilities as a homeowner. I hope I've challenged you to examine how authority is exercised. Thompson sat back, a slow smile crossing his face. You know, 25 families have moved out of Maple Grove in the 15 years I've been president. Not one until you ever fought back this way. Maybe that should have told me something. This admission marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not just their relationship but the entire culture of Maple Grove Estates. The months following the court case saw remarkable changes. Thompson, with Chen's legal guidance, rewrote the HOA bylaws to include flexibility clauses and an independent review board. The new regulations maintained community standards while acknowledging that residents might face temporary hardships, professional obligations, family emergencies, health issues that deserved consideration. Chen, meanwhile, had her lawn professionally landscaped and maintained, often working in her garden on weekends as a form of meditation from her Supreme Court duties. Neighbors began noticing the pair collaborating on community projects, their different perspectives creating innovative solutions to long-standing problems. Their unlikely friendship deepened over weekly coffee meetings that became legendary in the neighborhood. Thompson would bring HOA issues for Chen's perspective, while she'd discuss constitutional principles in everyday terms that helped him understand the broader implications of community governance. "You're teaching me law," Thompson joked one afternoon. "And you're teaching me people," Chen replied seriously. Their conversations attracted other residents, turning the local coffee shop into an informal community forum where complex issues received thoughtful discussion rather than heated argument. The transformation was remarkable. A community that had been governed by rigid rules was evolving into one guided by reasoned dialogue. The media occasionally revisited their story, particularly when HOA-related legislation appeared before Congress. Chen would receive calls asking for comment on the Maple Grove model of community governance that was gaining attention nationwide. She always deflected credit to Thompson, emphasizing that sustainable change required local leadership, not judicial mandates. Thompson, in turn, would tell reporters that his real education began when he stopped seeing Chen as an adversary and started seeing her as a neighbor with specialized knowledge that could benefit everyone. 1 year after their initial confrontation, the Maple Grove Estates HOA won a state award for innovative community governance. Chen attended the ceremony, sitting in the audience rather than beside Thompson on stage. During his acceptance speech, Thompson looked directly at her. "This recognition belongs to everyone who challenged me to be a better leader and to every resident who engaged constructively when our old ways weren't working." Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a leader is to be questioned by someone who knows what they're talking about. The audience, many of whom had followed the saga from the beginning, erupted in applause. Chen later reflected on the experience during an interview for a legal journal. "As judges, we often deal with abstract principles and their broad applications. But this neighborhood dispute reminded me that law lives in the daily interactions between citizens. The most significant legal moments aren't always in Supreme Court decisions, sometimes they're in how we choose to resolve conflicts in our own communities." She paused, thinking of Thompson. It's also a reminder that expertise and authority come in many forms. Bill Thompson knows more about building community consensus than many politicians I've met. I learned as much from him about practical governance as he might have learned from me about legal principles. The grass in Chen's front yard remained perfectly maintained, though occasionally she'd let it grow to exactly 3.5 inches, just enough to prompt a friendly text from Thompson rather than a formal violation notice. "Testing the new system?" he'd ask. "Making sure it's working properly," she'd respond. Their homes became gathering places for the neighborhood, hosting barbecues where residents discussed everything from local politics to Supreme Court decisions. Children would see them working together on community projects and assume they'd always been friends, unaware of the legal battle that had brought them together. As Chen prepared for another Supreme Court term, she often thought about how this suburban conflict had influenced her judicial philosophy. The experience reinforced her belief that law should serve people, not the other way around, and that the application of rules, whether constitutional or HOA-related, must always consider human circumstances and dignity. Meanwhile, Thompson's leadership style had evolved to emphasize collaboration over enforcement, building consensus rather than citing bylaws. The community that emerged from their conflict was stronger, more engaged, and more thoughtful about governance than either could have imagined. Years later, when asked about the most influential legal case of her career, Chen would sometimes surprise interviewers by mentioning not a Supreme Court decision but a grass height dispute in suburban Maryland. "It taught me that justice isn't just about being right, it's about finding solutions that serve everyone's interests." And Thompson, speaking at HOA conferences nationwide, would tell his audience, "The day I tried to find a Supreme Court justice was the day I learned that every resident has something valuable to teach you about leadership." The most important lesson? Listen before you enforce, understand before you judge. In the end, their story became exactly what neither had intended, a perfect example of how conflict, approached with mutual respect and intellectual humility, could transform a community for the better.